God is always watching over you. And he reminds us, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَقُولُوا قَوْلًا سَدِيدًا يُصْلِحْ لَكُمْ أَعْمَالَكُمْ وَيَغْفِرْ لَكُمْ ذُنُوبَكُمْ وَمَنْ يُطِعِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ فَقَدْ فَازَ فَوْزًا عَظِيمًا. Believers, be mindful of God, speak in a direct fashion and to good purpose, and He will put your deeds right for you and forgive you your sins. Whoever obeys Allah and His Messenger will truly achieve a great triumph. On my last visit last month, we continued to look at the idea of adab al-ikhtilaf, or the respect for dissenting, understanding, and opinions in the community of our scholars, and the value of adopting that framework and that approach in dealing not just with our issues of Sharia and of the issues of jurisprudence, but on the more mundane issues of community development and community affairs. For that framework of respect for dissent, that we respect the idea that on any given issue we will end up, given our national differences and inclinations, you will end up with slightly differing points of view. Today I would like to move our thoughts and our considerations to the idea of obligations. In the Islamic framework, like in most other religious frameworks, there are certain sets of obligations that as a believer one has to accept and then fulfill. And the obligations to society at large is a fundamental component of the general set of obligations within the Muslim tradition, in Islam. And when we talk about obligations, it is not rooted in a favor that we may be doing as individuals to the larger society, but it's rooted in a fundamental connection to our faith, and we would like to see how that is. When we talk about fulfilling societal obligations, it's connected to good character. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, told us that Allah sent him to perfect good character. Right? He sent him to perfect good character. Not to have good character, but to perfect it, to excel at it. And likewise, as followers of this Prophet, we are obliged to perfect good character. And good character cannot be exercised by us unless we have feeling for the other. Right? If you have only feelings for yourself, if you're selfish, you cannot really exercise good character. And this is something I'd like us to reflect on. And ultimately, good character is care for the other. And the ultimate care for the other is care for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, care for God. Because He is the ultimate other. Right? He is one we don't see. We cannot see Allah. And yet, we have a clear idea, given a revelation, and given our experiences, that we must fulfill our obligation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This cannot happen without good character. This is impossible without good character. Think about good character. You are generous. You respect the rights, the merits, and the dignity of others. And this is not easy to do. It's easy to think of rights that you have. I should not be treated with indignity. I should not be harmed. I should not suffer at the hands of others. That's easy to perceive. But we should not be harming others. We should not be treating others with indignity. We should not be taking away the rights of people. This is harder, because when you interact with people, unless we restrain ourselves, we will fall into the trap of taking more and giving less. And this is one of the things Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala points out about the oligarchs of Mecca. Right? In Surah the mutaffifin. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيْلٌ لِلْمُطَفِّفِينَ الَّذِينَ إِذَا اكْتَالُوا عَلَى النَّاسِ يَسْتَوْفُونَ وَإِذَا كَالُوهُمْ أَوْ وَزَنُوهُمْ يُخْسِرُونَ ألا يظن أولئك أنهم مبعوثون ليوم عظيم يوم يقوم الناس لرب العالمين. Woe to those that deal in fraud. Right? And this is one of the early Meccan surahs. And if you think about Meccan surahs are not talking about the oneness of Allah and the emphasizing the prophethood of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These are things that occur later in the Meccan period. In the initial Meccan period, it is a direct questioning of the practices of the oligarchs of Mecca, and Surah Al-Mutaffifin is one of them. Woe to those that deal in fraud, those who, when they have to receive my measure from men, exact full measure. You recall what I just said a few minutes ago? When we want to protect our rights, we're really insistent. And this surah is saying that these oligarchs, when they got something that they had to receive, they were very exact about it. But when they have to give by measure or weight to men, give less than due. وَإِذَا كَالُوهُمْ أَوْ وَزَنُوهُمْ يُخْسِرُونَ. This is a direct, if you will, a calling out by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of the bad character of the oligarchs of Mecca. And bad character in the Quran, good character in the Quran is associated with belief. And bad character in the Quran is associated with the opposite, disbelief. And if you think of these two words, because belief, the essence of belief is shukr. The essence of belief. When you have belief in Allah, you are grateful. You express gratitude. And the opposite of shukr is what? You know this. It's kufr. It's disbelief. It's denying Allah. It's denying the most ultimate other. Particularly the other who is your creator. Right? When we deny Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are denying that which we should be most grateful for. To Allah who is our creator. The one who has created us, who cares for us, who loves us. He says he loves us. Right? And that he shows complete mercy. And you remember how Rasulullah ﷺ described after one of the battles when a woman was looking for her child and she's running back and forth. And the Prophet noted this as her and said this to his companions, you know the feeling of this woman, she's looking for her child. Do you know what attachment is that this woman has for this child? And of course the companions naturally recognized this. Who would not recognize this? And Rasulullah ﷺ told them that Allah's mercy to his creation is more than the mercy that this mother is expressing in her haste back and forth looking for her child. Right? This is the framework in which we perceive and conceive of this ultimate other, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we think of this thing, the ultimate other and the obligation we have to the ultimate other and its connection to our obligations, we begin to understand why in the Muslim tradition the serving and the service of those who are other than me individually, is so important. And our tradition defined these obligations in two categories, fard ayn and fard kifaya. Right? And in many times, as believing Muslims, we are definitely focused on fard ayn and this individual obligation. You have an obligation to God. Yes, we understand that. We have prayers, we have our fasting, we give zakat, and zakatul mal it's a twofold obligation. It serves fard ayn, but it also serves a fard kifaya. Okay? And we will see how that is. Hajj, it's an obligation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A human being doesn't benefit from, another human being doesn't benefit from. But then there are a myriad of other obligations that are fard kifaya. And this fard kifaya is a very difficult concept. Right? It's a very difficult concept because when you don't fulfill fard ain, or your individual obligation, who is held responsible in Allah's eyes? You are, individually. I don't pray 5 times a day. My wife and my children are not accountable for that. I am. My parents are not accountable for that. I am. Right? If I do not make up my prayers, my wife or my parents or my children can't make up that for me. If I don't fast, or if I miss a fast, or if I take the opportunity to skip a fast because of traveling or a valid excuse, only I can make that fast up. I cannot tell my wife, you know, I'm tired, could you fast for me, please? You can't do that. That's the nature of individual obligation. Now, when you think about societal obligation, fard kifaya, this is extremely difficult, because the obligation of fard kifaya is on whom? Is it on you? Is it on you, Dr. Arif? Is it on me? It's on every one of us. But it can be fulfilled merely by Dr. Arif, or by myself, or by the two of us, or on behalf of all of the Muslims in Lancaster County, by the people who are in this masjid right now. So this is an interesting feature of fard kifaya, that some, and kifaya means enough, sufficient. If a sufficient number of people have fulfilled a societal obligation, then the obligation is fulfilled on behalf of every one of us. And if a sufficient number hasn't filled it, so let's say we need 20 people to do this job, only 10 people volunteer, and they do it, but the job isn't complete because it really required 20 people. Do you think those 10 people fulfilled the obligation for themselves? The answer is no. They tried, but it remained unfulfilled. Because you needed 20 people to do it. And the obligation remains unfulfilled on us as believers, on the whole community. So if this were an issue of importance to the Muslims in Lancaster, or an obligation on the Muslims in Lancaster, then it remained unfulfilled for every Muslim in Lancaster, whether that Muslim acknowledges it or ignores it. And that's why this issue of fard kifaya is a very difficult issue, and it is an issue that you need great, deliberate engagement with. But the societal obligation doesn't stop on behalf of Muslims to Muslims. Societal obligation extends to everyone. And that's why it becomes even more difficult. That's why it becomes even more difficult. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. Because this subject is a complex subject, what I can do, that is the beginning of it, is to share with you the incredible sense of obligation to fulfill societal obligation, this fard kifaya, as well as begin to engage in a conversation as a community on what those are, what is the nature of these societal obligations. But I want to make sure that we leave today with the understanding that each one of us is responsible for these societal obligations, and that unless we have ensured through engagement, through conversation, through investment, that this societal obligation is being fulfilled, we are in front of Allah obliged, continue to be obliged until it has been fulfilled. And may Allah forgive us if we do not fulfill this, but this is a sin. This is a sin. This is a collective sin of all of us when a societal obligation remains unfulfilled. And what is one of the challenges is, you could walk away today and you could think of a number of issues and fail to recognize that these issues are societal obligations. You might say, well, this is somebody else's problem. Right? and fail to recognize that the problem is actually yours, but in this framework of fard kifaya, not in this framework of fard ayn, not on an individual obligation level, but on a societal obligation level. So this is a difficult thing, but nevertheless, this difficulty cannot be simply put aside. So let me just look at briefly a couple of issues, and I recognize and I want to acknowledge that Salāt al-Jumu'ah is not a forum for a debate. I have the microphone, and you're not allowed to speak up unless I say something extremely wrong. So I recognize that, and I respect that. I might tell you something that is that in my understanding and the understanding of the scholars that I've dealt with is a societal obligation, and you may differ with it. And so if you do, I apologize in advance that you don't have the opportunity to immediately disagree with me, but I invite your disagreement after Salah. So looking at certain societal obligations, is it an obligation on us to make sure that those who are elderly, those who are poor, those who are in need, have certain basic needs fulfilled? Is this an obligation? As for kifaya? If you read any of the classical literature by scholars, they will tell you yes, it is. And in modern parlance, it is called a minimum level of living, which is reflected by minimum wage as a concept. Or more recently, according to Dr. Tariq Ramadan, many of you know what a great scholar, Muslim scholar he is, he talks about universal health care. That health care is not a luxury, but it's a right. And he frames it in both the Sharia framework as well as our modern frameworks of rights as a human right. How about air? Do you think it's our right to breathe air, clean, free, good air, or water? Yeah, you don't think about it, but it is. What if somebody took away that air from us? What would we have to do? So when you think about it in this way, the fact that many of our human activities pollutes the air beyond levels of tolerance is a big problem. How has the United States as a society solved this problem? It is solved by an institution called the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. If the laws that they've put in place are decimated, as the current administration is doing, what does that create? As an obligation back on us to restore those protections. The EPA has had some very, very good protections for this society that are being pulled back by Scott Pruitt and the President of the United States. Very harmful thing. Did you ever think that this is a societal obligation from the framework of Islam on you? I'm here to suggest to you that it is. This is a societal obligation. Because you're harming society, you're harming many, 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 many people, if not everybody that lives in this land. So this becomes a societal obligation. Now you might argue otherwise, and if you do, I'd like you to think about it. This point that this I'm presenting to you as a societal obligation, because one of the things we do as Muslims, given our distance from our own Sharia tradition, and how our own scholars created these obligations on the society itself, beyond the identity politics of who is a Muslim and who is not. Right? No, these are human issues, these are human problems, and fard kifaya has much more to do with what impacts all human beings rather than just one part of humanity. Whether it's a religious identity, or it's an ethnic identity, or it's a national identity. These things go beyond. So if you talk about global identities as human beings, I can ask you, what is our obligation to reduce the pollution of plastic in the world? It's a huge obligation that very likely most of us have never thought of. And some of us have thought of and said it's too big a problem on us. And we really can't handle it. The reality is that obligations such as these fard kifaya obligations, simply do not disappear because we as an individual, I as an individual, do not have the capacity to solve it. The obligation remains, and the engagement to find solutions remains. So I invite you to deeply think about this concept. Inshallah, in my next visit, we will develop this further with very specific cases that our Sharia scholars clearly defined as obligations in our past history as a measure to understand how you apply this principle to understand what are our fard kifaya in our current modern world and in the lives that we live. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين عباد الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون واقم الصلاة